here's what we want. The problem is with Trudeau. And we think the solution is pretty simple. Scrap the carbon tax, axe the carbon tax, get rid of it so we can finally lower gas prices and heating bills across the country.
This is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast. We're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. Today, I'm joined by two of my friends and colleagues. Franco, you're holding down the fort as our federal director there in Ottawa. And Nicholas, he is our Quebec director. Now, why do we have a kid from Alberta and a kid from Quebec here together? Because we all get screwed over by the carbon tax. So, Franco, this was kind of a bombshell for the CTF. Next year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is going to force everyone to pay a higher carbon tax rate. But this is the problem between all of us here on this call. One province is getting special treatment. Break it down for us.
Yeah, I mean, all provinces are equal, but one province is a little more equal in the eyes of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And that's because Trudeau is requiring taxpayers in 9 provinces to pay a higher federal carbon tax than what he's requiring in Quebec. So here's how it all works. Trudeau has a mandatory minimum carbon tax rate. Either you pay his federal carbon tax, or a province has to impose a provincial carbon tax that is at least as high as Trudeau's mandatory minimum. So Trudeau's mandatory minimum next year will cost about 14 cents per liter of gas. And every single province, well, every province but Quebec, will have to pay that carbon tax next year. It's going to go up to about 37 cents per liter of gas by 2030. So now Trudeau is going to be forcing taxpayers in every other province but Quebec to pay this higher carbon tax. But Quebec taxpayers or Quebec drivers, they won't have to pay as high of a carbon tax.
All right. So for normal people at 14 cents a liter, that's about $10 every single time you're filling up your minivan across Canada, other than in Quebec. So this put the fox among the pigeons here. Nick, what's the deal with Quebec's carbon tax? Can you explain it to us?
Yeah, for those who doesn't know, Quebec has its own provincial cap and trade carbon tax. The way that it works is that the government caps the level of emissions and then allows the companies to exchange and trade with each other to produce emissions and reduce them over time. It's a complicated way for Quebec to say that it has its own provincial carbon tax. But the difference here is that it's a lower carbon tax than the one that you're paying under the federal carbon tax. To give you an example, Quebec's provincial cap and trade carbon tax currently costs approximately 9 cents a liter per liter of gas and must stay above 4.8 cents a liter due to a minimum price on carbon. But the thing is, by 2030, based on the current projection, we should be paying up to 23 cents on the carbon tax per liter of gas.
Okay, so let me just break down the comparison, apples to apples, side by side. Trudeau's carbon tax rate next year, beginning in 2020 or beginning in 2023, different times in different provinces, must be paid by 9 provinces, every province but Quebec. Okay, so in the 9 provinces, it's going to cost 14 cents per liter of gasoline. In Quebec next year, the carbon tax just has to stay above 5 cents per liter of gasoline, right? We're all equal, some just a little bit more equal than others. Now in 2030, Trudeau's carbon tax rate in 9 provinces, 37 cents per liter of gasoline. Quebec's provincial carbon tax, 23 cents per liter of gasoline. So can you see that there is clearly a fundamental unfairness with Trudeau's carbon tax regime?
Yeah, for sure. It looks completely lopsided and unfair, but unfortunately, we've been down this road before when it comes to picking and choosing winners and losers as provinces go. No offense to anybody actually personally on this call. This is all government. So what reason, Franco, did the Trudeau government actually give when they tried to explain why everyone has to pay a higher carbon tax other than Quebec?
Good one. That's a good one. What reason did they give? They haven't given a reason. No, of course not.
Because I said so. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, they want to sweep this under the rug. They want Canadians not to notice. They want Canadians to not be paying attention to this fundamental unfairness. But guess what? The Canadian Taxpayers Federation and our supporters are paying attention. We are seeing what's going on. Now, look, some people on social media, the social media keyboard warriors, I've seen them all over Twitter, for example, screaming, but Franco is because Quebec has a cap and trade provincial carbon tax. Okay. But hold on a second. That doesn't pass the sniff test. That doesn't check out, because Nova Scotia also has right now a similar provincial cap and trade carbon tax as Quebec. Nova Scotia has reduced its emissions by 36% since 2005. But Trudeau didn't care. The Trudeau government just recently announced that they wouldn't allow Nova Scotia's provincial cap and trade carbon tax, even though it's similar to Quebec's, and that they'd be forcing Nova Scotians to be paying the higher Trudeau mandatory minimum carbon tax. Now, here's the thing. Trudeau is punishing Nova Scotians, but he should be asking Nova Scotians for advice, because they've done a good job reducing emissions, even though Nova Scotia has by far the lowest carbon tax on gasoline in Canada. Now let's look at the West Coast, the left coast, Chris's former home, where you have British Columbia, that had the highest carbon tax in Canada for years, but emissions continued to go up. Of course, emissions also went up during the first year of Trudeau's national carbon tax. Mm-hmm. So what does this tell us, Simmer? This tells us that Trudeau's carbon tax was always about politics, not the environment.
Yeah, for sure. It has no bearing. It doesn't. All you have to do is look at the states. They have no federal carbon tax there. They've actually reduced their emissions. How? Because they've largely switched over to natural gas. As far as numbers go, I do want to point out that folks in Atlantic Canada, a lot of us who, spent more time in Ottawa or out west, probably don't realize this. So many folks in Atlantic Canada rely on home heating oil still. Like outside of the downtown big city in Halifax, there are so many homes that still have, it's called furnace oil. They still rely on that, or propane. Folks, if you're listening in Atlantic Canada, you're going to get nailed with this carbon tax starting next year. So we see that it has no rhyme and reason when it comes to emissions. We know it's going to cause people to pay through the nose, and we know it's all about politics. What's the solution here? What do we want to see from this?
Well, in a perfect world, I would like to have no carbon tax nor any cap and trade carbon tax. But what we want here is that we want Quebecers, we want to warn Quebecers that Trudeau is going to rise their carbon tax in Quebec next. As my colleague Franco just said, if he was able to do it in Nova Scotia and everywhere else, what is stopping him from rising the carbon tax in Quebec next? So we need our Quebec politicians, both MNAs and MPs, to stick up and to fight for us, and to make sure that they fight against Ottawa's intrusion and tax hikes, the way that Premier Legault did in 2019. Back then, the Quebec government, with the government of Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, went in front of the Supreme Court to fight against the federal carbon tax. Of course, we know the results now. But the thing is, back then, he already made a case, and I would just quote his word: "We think it should be up to the provinces, and only up to the provinces, to decide how to apply a cost to carbon." So that was true in 2019, and it's even truer now. And that's exactly what we would expect from our politicians, like Premier Legault, our MNAs, and our federal MPs. We have to push back and make sure that the federal carbon tax does not happen in Quebec.
Simmer, let me just chime in here for a quick second, right? Because look, taxpayers, even in the other 9 provinces, like, this isn't about being angry with Quebec. We want all of our politicians to fight for taxpayers and to make sure the federal government isn't soaking us, right? So here's what we want. The problem is with Trudeau. And we think the solution is pretty simple. Scrap the carbon tax, axe the carbon tax, get rid of it, so we can finally lower gas prices and heating bills across the country.
Yeah, agreed. And that way it's equal too. And we won't have this infighting or pitting other provinces against each other and all that nonsense. I want to raise this with you, Franco, and Nick, feel free to chime in here, because it's bugging the heck out of me. It's this constant refrain that we are hearing from the federal government, from the Trudeau government, and unfortunately through some people who've been duped by this government, who say something like that, like, "Oh, sure, we pay the carbon tax, but just wait, you get more back than you pay into the carbon tax." So number one, we know that's silly. The government does not have like a money appreciation machine. So just on the math side, that's not going to work. But how, on the scale of, 1 to Santa Claus, how made up is that phrase of we're going to get more back than you pay it?
Yeah, I'd probably say it's about a Rudolph. No, I mean, look, it's totally incorrect. If you think that the government is going to tax everyone, then skim some off the top to pay for their oodles of bureaucrats, and then somehow make everyone better off through rebates, well, then I've got some oceanside property in Regina that I want to sell you. But hey, don't take my word for it, right? Look at the parliamentary budget officer. That's the government's own nonpartisan independent budget watchdog. And the PBO says that the government's claim is really using magic math, okay? Next year, the carbon tax will cost the average household, depending on what province you live in, anywhere between $400 all the way up to $847, even after the rebates. So next year, it'll cost the average family hundreds of dollars. That's 1 year, hundreds of dollars, even after including the rebates. But look, I even see some of the keyboard warriors out there on Twitter try to argue that like carbon taxes aren't inflationary. So let me just address that. The whole point of the carbon tax is inflationary. The whole point of the carbon tax is to rise the price of gasoline or to increase home heating bills. That's the whole point. So every time Trudeau is driving in the car, driving past the Shell that shows the higher gas prices, he must be patting himself on the back, because the whole point of the carbon tax is to increase the cost of living.
Exactly. And folks, you can't hammer that home enough. Thank you for that, Franco. This is a feature, not a bug. Okay. So the next time, especially a federal politician puts their hands up in the air and they're in government, they say, oh my goodness, look at the cost of energy. Dude, they made it that way. This is the whole plan. They wanted to make it so you find it unaffordable to fill up your car with gasoline or diesel, and you find it unaffordable to heat your home with natural gas, propane, or furnace oil. The real nasty rub here is that what's the alternative? There isn't an affordable, abundant, available alternative for most working people in Canada. So at this point, it's just punishment for using an essential, and I'm going to borrow your term here, Franco, inelastic demand for energy here. So, right? So folks, this just amounts to punishment for heating your home, living, eating groceries, and driving to work. Thank you both, gentlemen, Nicholas and Franco, for highlighting this. Folks, keep up the fight. I'm really serious about this, because when push comes to shove, these politicians are ultimately worried about their own necks and their own jobs. So take a look at your home heating bill, take a look at your price at the gas pump, and you send them an email and you say, you know what? I'm scared about not being able to afford to heat my home this winter. And if you don't do something about this, I'm not only going to vote against you, I'm going to get all my friends and neighbors together to door knock against you in your riding. I promise you that they will definitely get attention for that. Folks, thank you so much for this, and check out our website, taxpayer.com, for more.